then when it is, we can get started.
We are now recording. When we are done recording, I will let everyone know.
There's also a little doodad, right? Like I'm maybe pointing to the wrong side of the screen, but you've got a little recording doodad up there. Yeah. All right. Pray begin.
Awesome. Can you all hear me? Give me a little thumbs up. Great. Thank you, Alex, for hosting. Thank you, Jason, for spurring this thing into action and doing the community building that you're so good at. It's an honor to take the micro stage, as it were, for this mini Prosody Talk, and to kind of kick it off. My working title for this talk, I just put it in the chat, is Roll 3d6 to generate your OSR, and hopefully we can know what that means by the end of the talk. But I want to give some context. I speak not from some position as like the uber scenester or even a major like player in the OSR space, but part of what I hope to convey is that doesn't matter, that the OSR isn't something that a given person decides what it is and all of that stuff. And in fact, the worst elements of the OSR are because of those sorts of things. And so I'll start from the top down there. What is the OSR? A valid answer would be it's a community, right? And I think that a lot of people see it that way. It's a group of people that think similarly about role-playing games that all share the same hobby. And so it's a sort of distributed fandom, but it's also kind of a school of thought from that. And I think that is where it gets into trouble and also where it triumphs. Where it gets into trouble is the fact that people see it as this is the right way to play role-playing games as a whole. And the emphasis on certain elements of the hobby and the people that emphasize them and speak from their various pundits, like their blogs and whatever, it can be seen and as a sort of elitism that the OSR, what it stands for, is the old school renaissance or the old school revolution. And so it inspires this thing of people like, yeah, let's get back to what made D&D good and all of this stuff like that. Let's go back to the BX Commons or like the original Red Book or whatever. And there's good things to draw there, right? To like remember what role-playing games used to be and the different things that informed them and various things like that. But also, I think, like I said, that's where the OSR gets into trouble. And this talk would be more than consumed multiple times over in its runtime if I was to talk about the social landscape of the OSR. And maybe I'll link to some blogs of people that do rundowns of that. But there's a lot of sub-communities. But there's one event that bears mentioning, which is the collapse of G+, which obviously didn't just affect the OSR, but the OSR as it is today is very, very different than it was 3 years ago, 5 years ago. But I think in some better ways. And it's another thing that just to round out the talk about, well, let me give some context about that event. So Google Plus, for those of you that don't know, was a sort of just social network, a very bare bones one that Google had, one of their many social network projects, and it wasn't hitting their target metrics for a thriving Google project. And their kind of standpoint is if it doesn't become a mega hit, we just eventually pull the plug. You can argue with that. That's what Google eventually does. And the OSR was popular with a couple communities. The Google Plus was popular with a couple communities, notably the role-playing community, because it was small and easy to control, small spaces, and various other things that people liked. It was very simple, and I think a lot of the role-playing crowd, is a different age bracket than the people that are coming to Reddit, like these college kids or the people that are coming to Twitter and discovering these things. And so it felt like a place that they could make their own. I was surprised when I first realized, because like when I realized it through Invisible Sun. I was, during the Kickstarter of Invisible Sun, trying to find out where are people talking about this game online, because there's so much to talk about, especially since it was run as an ARG. And then I found that and I realized that there were all these other communities there. And that's when I kind of started getting exposed to the fact that there were different facets and schools of thought and factions, sometimes even aggressively so, within role-playing. I thought it was very one-dimensional. I thought everyone was just the same type of nerd. There are a lot of multifaceted, sort of fiefdoms within that. But okay, so enough about the scene stuff, because talking about, it's only so interesting to talk about the community. What the OSR primarily is people who emphasize kind of the game in role-playing game. That the best elements of this in that view are when the toyetic, if I could coin a term, or the kind of the elements that you can play around with, like chess pieces, are interesting, not necessarily the elements that share from, you know, the best part of a therapy session, right? Because some people like what makes a therapy session refreshing is what makes role playing refreshing for them, and that would be almost diametrically opposed to, although not necessarily incompatible, as I hope to show, as what people would find interesting in a role playing game. So if you want to create a false dichotomy, although again, I think that the lesson of modern RPGs is that there is no dichotomy and you can pick elements from all your favorite games and it'll work, is that there's this focus on game and there's focus on narrative. The kind of core maxim of the OSR, at least in the view of a lot of people from within it, is that it's unscripted, that the story is what happens, and you honor that. That if the dice roll a certain way, you never fudge it, right? If the dice roll a certain way and your character dies, they're dead. Reckon with that, right? Maybe they can come back to life, maybe something's going to happen, but we don't just retcon it just because we didn't like it. Like, it's a game, and that's kind of what happens with that. And already some people could take issue with any one of those things, but because of that fact, a lot of other things flow out. And so I'm going to jump ahead in my notes a little bit to talk to give some more concrete examples along those similar lines, because what the OSR is at its best is a collection of games, a collection of creators, and a collection of conventional wisdom that informs new games in this space. And, you know, on that note, the OSR, one of the things it has been to me, or that I found, is an incredibly prolific group of people. That the people in the OSR are some of the people that they will create content all the time. All of the Discord channels, all of the Reddit stuff for that there's something about it that brings people alive and that they want to create stuff. They're hacking their own games. Their blogs are active, and it's good stuff. It's like really imaginative. Whereas in the story gaming space, there is also that. There are some forums, like I frequent the Gauntlet forums now and then, you know, in their space, and they're active in playing games and creating content. But it's also a space where it very much puts like a respect on what someone's going to do at their own table. That I can't make something better than what you could make yourself. And there's this idea of, you know, just creating, like, there isn't really a need to create adventures for those settings because it's assumed that all of that work is going to happen at the table, you know. And similarly, we don't see Monte Cook Games putting out adventures for Invisible Sun necessarily, and I don't think they will, because that's not the type of game they view it as. But with the OSR, like, it really is. It's about, like, okay, let me read this list. So this is from Scrap Princess, who collected it from a lot of other sources. It's from Scrap Princess's blog, which is, I think, called Monster Manual Sewn from Pants. And it's kind of the sort of 10 commandments of the OSR, which is, or top 10 aphorisms of the OSR, with bits stolen from Gregory Blair, Brian Harbin, FM Geist, ZXU, Brian Murphy, Dirk Detweiler Lakety, and Daniel Davis. And some of those people are authors or bloggers of various things. And I won't name all their works right now because it'll just be a word soup. Okay, but here's the list. So number 1, this is a game about interacting with this world as if it were a place that exists. So, which I think is a crystallization of one of the things that role-playing games as a medium, that's what can make them cool, is that they can respond to what you think up authentically. Whereas that's where video games kind of break down, that the video game, you interact with it as a simulation of a place that exists, not as a place that exists, that you can't just walk anywhere. Sometimes there will be some walls to the world, whereas that isn't necessarily the case, or they're much harder to find in a role-playing game. You're essentially finding the walls in someone else's mind, you know, if you encounter a wall like that. 2, killing things is not the goal. There's some other goal to an OSR game that killing things is designed as an obstacle to. Typically, the goal is to get gold. That's like kind of seen as the default, but it could be a lot of other things. And there's a lot of thought given to what do we award XP for? And I think that's something that, of course, isn't unique just to OSR, but it is a tenet of it. 3, there is nothing that is supposed to happen. Whatever happens in a given session, that's the story of that session. There isn't like an idea of a narrative beforehand. The narrative emerges. The narrative is whatever happens. The narrative is the tale of how we completed our objectives. Whereas in other games, that's sometimes even explicitly not the case. For example, a story game that I could throw out would be Trophy. Trophy, there's 5 rings, you know at the end the adventurers are going to die. That's very much something where something is supposed to happen intentionally to create a certain tone. 4, unknowability and consequence make everything interesting. So the OSR never wants to move fully away from dice and those sorts of things and become like a GM-less game or something like that, because those are the things that it loves. It loves the idea that you could fail a roll and maybe die in one hit. Like that dynamism is important to what it's trying to create. 5, and this is a very interesting one, you play as your character, not as the screenwriter writing your character. And I know, and a lot of other game mindsets, it's explicitly that way, and they want a lot of table talk, and they want like, oh, I'd love to see a scene of this person and this person together, so we can bring to the forefront this person's insecurity or something, and kind of see some of that on camera. And I love that type of game and like that type of table talk, but that's not really what people would think of when they think of the OSR. But again, not incompatible. 6, it's your job, speaking to you as a player, to make your character interesting and to make the game interesting for you. So the OSR is as a kind of school of thought, puts a lot of emphasis on player buy-in. That if you show up to a table and we're playing, Deep Carbon Observatory, the adventure, and you build a character that doesn't want to do this adventure, you're failing in your role as a player. That it's your goal to create a character that is going to engage with the material presented before you, right? And so there's this is something that I think is a classic boogeyman of the RPGs. I've never been at a table where this has really been a problem ultimately, but people talk about it online ad nauseum. 7, if you find yourself in a fair fight, your tactics suck. That is kind of interesting because that's kind of not contrasting story games, but contrasting modern D&D, which I think is the OSR's main enemy, which it's any conflict in the OSR and story games I think is unnecessary, but the OSR kind of views modern D&D as like how I don't know, a degraded version of D&D, and hopefully not in a dismissive way, but this idea that if the DM puts an encounter of enemies before you in 5th edition, you're expected to fight them, because that's kind of why you're there. Pretty much the entire system revolves around rules for combat. You get XP for killing monsters. It's the thing that you're there to do. Whereas in the OSR, it views combat as like a fail state. Combat is what happens when your plans go wrong. You know what I'm saying? And there's this also, it's not on the list, but there's an aphorism of good plans don't roll. So if you have a clever idea of how to achieve your goal, it happens, right? And you roll when there is a risk, right? Or when you're exposing yourself. So it's almost kind of like a goal to like roll as little as possible, which is another really interesting thing. Because anytime you're picking up the dice, you're picking up your character's life in your hands, 8, the answer is not on your character sheet. So the OSR kind of de-emphasizes abilities and like too many buttons to push in your character sheet, because the whole electric magic of it is thinking outside the box and thinking about, with the toys I have at my disposal, what could I do that could make them greater than the sum of their parts? It isn't just about which of these 5 abilities is the tactically correct one to do right now. Okay, next turn. Okay, next turn. And if you see, if you watch actual plays of 5th edition, a lot of times they don't really get outside the character sheet, if that makes sense. That everything they do is because they're this class, because they're that race, and because they're doing the things expected of that character. Whereas with the OSR, you start with so little. You might start with like 4 items, your couple stats, and that's it. You don't really have a lot of abilities. So it's about making something more. A lot of times you might just start with a farmer, a pig, and something else. And I won't go too much into systems. 9 is things are swingy. So there's this idea that encounters aren't balanced because the PCs aren't the protagonists. They're just inhabitants of the world. And that kind of touches on a lot of different other ideas. But one of them is, I'm going to circle back around at this point because it's an important one, but you could rock up to an encounter that is way too difficult for you. And it's the job of the players to recognize that that's the case and to be like, hey guys, we're level 1. We found a dragon. We shouldn't fight the dragon, right? And what do we do instead? What do we do to make this a situation that is survivable, even if it isn't winnable, Or you might encounter a group of enemies that you steamroll very easily, and that's fine. That can be a thrill when a lot of the rest of the game is so difficult. So, and similarly in the dice, like things can be swingy, and it isn't about trying to engineer a system where 50% of the time or 75% of the time the characters always succeed or something like that. And then number 10 on the list is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but it's you will die. And it's said that way not to be like a threat, but to be an expectation of the type of game that this is. Like if I pick up Dark Souls for the first time, or if I pick up Hollow Knight, or one of those games that is designed to create that really engaging feeling of challenge, there's this expectation that if I've never played before, it's possible for someone to play that entire game and never die. There's, Twitch and YouTube are full of perfect runs, things like that. But if it's your first time playing the game, probably not, because death is part of the process to learn how to play this game well. And when I died, it was typically because of decisions I made somewhere along the line. And that can be really engaging to learn from that. But to support that type of thing, we have to have a certain idea of what a character is, and it has to be easy and not tedious to make a character, and those sorts of things. Okay, now to circle back a little bit. For my money, the really engaging thing about the OSR is the platonic ideal of the OSR is the sandbox. That this fiction, and it's always some sort of illusion, right? That you could strike out in any direction and there'd be something fascinating waiting for you. That the world exists, something is going on, it's ticking on in the background, that some interpersonal drama would be happening between a farmer and his neighbor, even if you weren't there to witness it. And the fact that you were there to witness it meant that you were catching something that wouldn't have happened otherwise. It isn't a bunch of story beats waiting for you to arrive and then things spring into action. You don't just enter dungeon rooms and monsters are sitting there waiting to fight you. Like they might be gone. You might encounter the lair and the monster isn't there at the moment. Like that's the type of idea where it's a living space, it's an ecosystem. That is kind of the OSR at its best. Okay, now to think about, a lot of what I said isn't unique, again, to the OSR. It just happens to be held precious by the OSR. And of course, we can see these things in story games. But kind of to tie this back to Invisible Sun and why it's important to me is Invisible Sun can tell a lot of types of stories. The setting, anyway. The setting is disposition that it can do all sorts of things. And I make that transparent to my players. I have a thing I call campaign frameworks. And I say, what type of story do you guys want to tell in these X many sessions that we're allotting ourselves? If we're doing a 10-session campaign, something like that. And I give them things like the war. Do you want the whole goal of this campaign to be discover the truth about the war? Do you want it to be overthrow the Deathless Triumvirate? Because if you do, I can think about that ahead of time. Do you want it to be urban picaresque, where an entire session could be the Vislae go out for drinks and that's fine, and it's just about exploring small moments in their lives? Do you want it to be dungeon crawly? Do you want the entire campaign to be going to destroy hate cysts? And based on that, I might tweak certain things in the rules or pick things from systems that do that type of thing well. Because I think Invisible Sun as written, rules as written, can handle a wide variety of those story arcs, but some of them will be less satisfying than another system would do it. Like if you're trying to run Invisible Sun as a straight dungeon crawl, there are other systems, I believe, that deliver the straight dungeon crawl experience, at least in the OSR conception of what a dungeon crawl is, better. For example, there's no inventory system in Invisible Sun to speak of, and you lose certain things without that. There's no resource management system, that type of thing. You can't necessarily die from starvation unless it was introduced as like a GM shift or something like that. But when you add in things in a way that's not tedious, and that some systems have figured out how to do this, where inventory is slot based and you have a certain amount of slots, and it's very simple. Of are your slots full, then you're encumbered, whatever, or things where if you want to grab something out of your bag in combat, you roll a die that's equal to the number of slots you have in your inventory. So like if the standard person has like an 8-slot inventory, trying to get, then it takes your entire turn to retrieve that item and you can use it next turn. So at that, it becomes a mini game for characters to like pack their bag. That like they want these 4 items in the top slots, and then the items in the bottom slots they might not be able to pull out in a pinch, and that kind of stuff. Like it isn't really a conception in a story game because it's discarded. It's the idea of, even if you didn't even say you had this item on you, sure, you have it because it'll make a good scene. Whereas the OSR would say, no, you have what you have, and a good scene would be you trying to figure out how to survive even though you forgot something important, right? You forgot those extra rations or something like this. And you'll think about to pack it next time, and that type of thing. And again, you could also do a hybrid, like, you could borrow things from, Dungeon World and, oh man, there's one that, there's a cyberpunk game, The Sprawl, which is one of my favorite cyberpunk, powered by the apocalypse games, where gear can be quantum, meaning you could have, you could literally have in your inventory just a little thing that says gear, and that could be a rocket launcher, a grappling hook. It could be whatever in the moment you decide what it is, but it can only be one thing. Blades in the Dark also does this, where you have the whole inventory of items, but you don't pack before a mission. You just choose how many slots you have, and then you fill those slots, and that's what you had all along, right? that's not necessarily an OSR idea, but it's a great way to play if you're trying to do that heist type game. And that's the thing that you're an OSR idea is, what are we testing the players on? Because the game should be, if you always succeed, why are we here at the table? We could just be writing fan fiction, or at least that's how the thinking goes. And if you always fail, then you have a bad GM, right? And so there needs to be something where the player could be good at the game, and actually perform better by the fact that they're good. Whereas the story game mindset, or at least some people's mindset, is that shouldn't happen. That the only way to be good at the game is to entertain your friends, and any other skill other than that is discrimination or something. Whereas it can be satisfying for someone to feel like they're figuring out how a world works, and they're learning to exploit it to their ends, and they're learning to, become a master of their environment. So, I like, it's a good thought experiment. I'm kind of building this game now of what would Invisible Sun look like with a simple resource management system, then inventory with smaller, more crunchy classes, with Vislae that feel a little bit more fragile, and and those sorts of things. And I think that the types of stories that it could tell and the tension that would be engendered at the table would be a lot different. And those experiences of think about if a character dies in 5th edition, for example, and you want to make a new one, it's going to take you like 15 to 20 minutes, especially if it's a new player, right? If it's an experienced player, they might already have another character made, or they could like immediately go to an online generator. But for systems where you just roll 3d6 stats in order and then consult a table and that's your starting gear, you've made a character in less than 5 minutes. And so suddenly this idea of, character death isn't such an issue, because you're taking the lessons you learned with you to the next character anyway. And the next character is essentially just a new role-playing prompt that you're pulling out of a hat, right? And a new set of numbers to tweak to your advantage. And then it becomes really satisfying to have a character that lived several sessions and that has become strange and weird and scarred because of that. And hopefully your character sheet starts out small, when you start the game, and becomes very large later. Whereas in games with the character sheet already from a character that has done nothing on screen yet is already so full of stuff, it almost seems like a hassle to put more on there, or at least for some people. But so yeah, I mean, that's kind of what makes it tick. I think in summary, it's to kind of hit a few basic takeaways. The platonic ideal is the sandbox. This idea that there is nothing you're expected to do. The party determines their own goals. They strike out in any direction, and the GM kind of knows what's there because they have some notes about the whole world as a whole. Things interact with each other. There's an ecosystem. The world ticks on in the background. You are part of the world, but not what the world revolves around. And then zooming out from the game logic to be that the OSR is a really vibrant community, and it can be a really really fun community that people write, and there's metatextuality that authors will reference each other in books, and authors will explore really deep stuff. Like Patrick Stewart, some of the stuff that he's doing, and some of the reason I admire his work is that it's almost like RPG literature. Like I have to read the modules a couple times to understand what is going on in the background. Why are the NPCs here? What were they doing when we arrived? Like what, schemes have been going on? Because it isn't just spelled out like that. Because it doesn't want you to spell it out to the players like that. It's there's at least a little bit of opacity. Similarly, I could point to video games that do this well. Like again, Dark Souls and Hollow Knight. Those games don't just have a bunch of expository text or an NPC that tells you anything. They're at least somewhat cryptic, and that's part of why people love them. So yeah, that's all I was going to say. I'd love to open up to, I haven't been able to follow the chat that frequently because I'm not a Twitch streamer. I'm baffled by how Twitch streamers, how fast they read. But if anyone has any questions, I would love to open it up to that. Any